Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on how to get Android games to work on your computer. Let's get started. Before I jump into the nitty-gritty, I will make you aware of a couple of disclaimers here. First off, I will be using an emulator. If you've never heard of an emulator, have no idea what it is, essentially it's a piece of software that allows two operating systems to communicate with one another because they don't typically talk the same language. So in this case, I'm allowing Windows with this piece of software called Nox to communicate with Android, because essentially what the software is doing is it's translating what Windows is saying to what Android can understand and vice versa. That being said though, emulators are also notorious for using a lot of processing power. So if you have a potato and you're trying to run this on a computer that doesn't have a lot of hardware, it may not run the best. It may run a little sluggish, laggy, etc. So just so you're aware. The other thing too is, if you're not already aware of this, the emulators generally run older versions of Android. That being said, not all applications on the Play Store may necessarily work on the emulator, so your mileage may vary in that sense as well. Alright, with those points out of the way, let's just jump right into it and see what we can get done here. So first things first, head on to noxandroidemulator.com, scroll down and look for the download links for the emulator. Once you've done that and downloaded the actual emulator, which will be done automatically through the launcher, and it'll also be installed automatically, you just press the little start button once it finishes, and ta-da! It'll just load up, and then once you are in, there's a couple things you want to do. First off, if you're not already aware, you have to have a Gmail account in order for this to actually work. Why? Because, well, in order to even access the Play Store, you need a Google account, at least as far as I'm aware. Once you make a Google account or use an existing one, you just log in and then go into the store and get the application you would like to use on the emulator. In my case, since I have a Hades Star community of players that I make YouTube videos every single week for, you will see that I will install that game. Now once it's installed and downloaded and all that good stuff, you just open it like any other application in any other, Android device. And then we'll start with a couple of fun parts from here on out. So one of the primary things to note, if the game is not by default a landscape supported game or does not support landscape, is that once you open the game, it'll obviously open in portrait mode, so you'll get these gray bars on the side, which looks kind of ugly and disgusting and so on and so forth, but there is a way to handle that. Now on Android, you can do a whole bunch of things you can't do on iOS. One of them is modify a lot of the things that the operating system does, including forcing games to do certain things that normally it wouldn't without these extra programs. Now, what I used to use for Hades Star, because it didn't always used to support landscape mode, is I used to use this app called Rotation Control. This application essentially forces the game to run on landscape mode, and it does it without like stretching it out or making it look weird. Well, that weird anyway, to the point where it just looks aesthetically displeasing. And that way you can actually force games that normally would run on portrait mode to run on landscape mode. And that way you can take advantage of that landscape real estate that looks so beautiful once you get it done. Now the next thing to note is that the emulator by default will have a set resolution that will be like 1280 by 980 or something like that. It'll be very low and it'll look slightly pixelated. If that bothers you, you can actually adjust it inside the emulator settings. Now obviously if you put the resolution a little higher, it may stress your hardware a little bit more because you're forcing the computer, or essentially the emulator, or both technically, to push out a higher resolution images every second. And then on top of that, assuming you have really poor hardware, you're running the emulator on like meh things, you want to set the settings really low. Otherwise you can set them as high as you want. For me, obviously my system can handle the emulator just fine, so I set it all the way high. I set since I have a GPU or a graphics card, which is not built into the processor, it's an actual dedicated card, I set it to OpenGL so I can use the graphics card for rendering whatever things it can actually be used for that. But anyway, you can adjust these settings as you will to make it run a little bit better on the system that you are trying to get games or whatever applications actually to run on your computer. Now I also got a really not good question, and it's funny because as I was creating this video I was like, okay, that's a good one, you're a smart boy. So essentially, normally without any modifications to whatever you're doing with the emulator, you would actually have to use your mouse to control everything, which sucks. But this emulator, Nox at least, has a really nice little feature. You can actually have this little keybind control menu where you can set specific keybinds to specific areas on the screen, and then control it with a specific key. So basically you make a little bubble, you put a little keybind, whatever letter you want to associate with it on the keyboard or whatever key, and then that key will now press that specific area without you having to use the mouse to do it manually. Now you can also do gestures this way. Hades Star doesn't really need gestures, so I don't use that function, but you can if you want to. The next thing I will discuss is you can actually have multiple emulators. You can actually have, like, you know, presets or saved versions of this program where you can run multiple different instances of this emulator. Obviously, the more emulators you run, the more stress this will put on your system. So if you're going to do this, generally you want to run it as low a setting as possible so it doesn't stress the crap out of your system, especially if you're doing actual work. Now, if you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, I am going to show you what the implication of this specific function is. So in games, especially like Hades Star for example, where some people like starting mining farms and don't have a second phone or second device, whatever, you can actually multi-box using the same computer with this function of instancing different emulators. So you can have one emulator be your main account, and then you can have the second emulator be your alternative account, and they work as separate machines, so you can log into one account on one of them and then log into another account on the other. And in that way you can play the same game on two different accounts at the same time. Now, this is my fair warning to you. Some game developers and different games do not like you to multi-box, so use this at your own risk. I am not going to take any responsibility if you get banned for doing this, but this is just my fair warning to you so you are aware of the potential consequences of doing this. Hades Star's developers don't really care if you multi-box as long as you're not trolling and doing something that would inherently break the game. So in that sense it's okay here, but in other games it may not be. That's why this is a warning to you, so in case it isn't okay, you keep that in mind. Now, with that being said, this is pretty much all there is to it. There's not really much else. I've pretty much given you all the little secrets I have and all the little things I can do with this emulator. If you guys have any questions, leave them down below. If you have any issues, just make them known, because I didn't have any problems when I first installed the emulator, so yes. Anyway, click like on the video if you enjoyed and found this useful. You know, subscribe, do all the good things, hit the bell icon, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!